Is Microsoft Unified Support busting your IT budget? Well, you're not alone. US Cloud is the global leader in third-party Microsoft enterprise support, and they're helping enterprises slash cost by 30 to 50% versus Microsoft Unified, all while getting faster response times from domestic engineers. No offshoring, no long waits, just expert support you can count on 24/7, 365. Trusted by 50 of the Fortune 500 companies and offering senior-level engineers with an average of 14 years experience with Microsoft technologies, US Cloud is a smarter alternative for premium Microsoft support without the premium price. Ready to make the switch? Book a call at uscloud.com to get started today. That's uscloud.com.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. Hope you didn't get fooled by any April Fool's Day jokes here as we move into April of 2025. We recorded a show. We recorded one of our monthly, AI and Cloud News of the Month shows. I was talking to Aaron and Brandon, as we always do, and we were digging into, just some of the trends around AI, around NVIDIA. We were kind of talking about the GTC conference, and we kind of got into this discussion about, just kind of the ongoing drumbeat from NVIDIA, from Jensen Huang, about that everything is always about, you've got to have the latest and greatest. And we understand, from a vendor perspective, that's always sort of the thing. But it got me thinking, and I should have probably brought it up on the show, but I thought, well, I've got to do 100 shows a year. I might be able to hold this back for a weekend perspective. It got me thinking, I oftentimes draw this comparison between NVIDIA right now, so sort of NVIDIA's moment, for good or for bad, and the AI moment, and sort of Cisco's moment when the internet was taken off. So circa 1998 to 2000, 2001, and so forth. And I keep kind of drawing parallels between the two of them. And I know some people sort of say, well, the world's much different and they're not as, technically they're not as overvalued from a stock price and so forth. But as I was talking to Brandon and Aaron, a couple of things jumped to mind, and as sort of historical things, having been at Cisco during that time and kind of involved with some of the stuff. And I thought I would kind of turn that into a weekend perspective. And so we're going to dig into that after the break.
This episode is sponsored by Postman. Postman is the world's leading API collaboration platform, and they just launched Postman AI Agent Builder, the quickest way to build AI agents. Start building at postman.com/podcast/cloudcast.
And we're back, and good to be back with everybody for another weekend perspective. As I mentioned at the top of the show, a couple of things jumped out at me this past week as we were talking about NVIDIA, about sort of this AI moment that we're in. And I don't want to say the amount of money that's flowing into AI, because that is what it is. People decide to make bets. We're seeing certain trends, over the tech industry over the last 20 years, especially on certain types of things, especially around certain consumer things, consumer platforms. It's kind of winner take all. And so we're seeing, bets by a lot of very large people, a lot of large companies around sort of a winner take all approach in terms of how they're investing. And that's fine, right? Whether it works out or not, we'll see. In some cases it's worked out in the past. In other cases, it's crashed and burned, and that's fine. That's the nature of investing, of trying to predict the future and all that stuff. But as we were talking about NVIDIA, and NVIDIA has obviously gone through a little bit of a downturn, not downturn, but sort of a little bit of a dip since the DeepSeek stuff was announced, and people started to say, well, maybe there are some flaws in their general theory that the only way to be successful in AI is to be at the absolute forefront, absolute frontier, leading edge of what's going on, and that everything coming is going to be 100x bigger than what's going on right now. And that's fine. That's a perspective that Jensen can put on there. Obviously, NVIDIA has great insight into what people are doing with their technologies, and kind of seeing what's happening with the frontier of some of the new generative AI stuff, and that's great. But what kind of jumped out at me, and as I was talking to Aaron and Brandon on the Cloud News of the Month, Cloud and AI News of the Month show, was a couple of moments that I kind of remember from having been at Cisco during the internet moment, kind of the first internet moment, which we've talked about several times in the show, kind of having some parallelism to what we're seeing right now in the AI moment. And those two moments were this. So around 2001, so let me put this in perspective. So at the time, let's go back to say 2000, 1999-ish, Cisco was kind of the Pied Piper for the internet. John Chambers was very much in the same role as Jensen Huang. He was kind of the Pied Piper of the internet in the same way that Jensen is the Pied Piper of AI. Great. Very charismatic leader, was doing extremely well, leading his company, and appeared to be in every segment of the market, for what the internet was, what networking was at the time. And if they weren't in a segment of it, they were acquiring companies. As I mentioned a couple weeks ago, when I was there, we acquired, I think, 125 companies just in the period of time that I was there, which was like 96 to about 2010. And most of those acquisitions were closer to the 97, 98 to 2001, 2002 timeframe. So, similar to what NVIDIA is doing today in terms of, you look at their portfolio, you hear them lay out what they're doing, and you kind of go, they are everywhere. They were also the largest market cap company in the stock market. So Cisco at the time was roughly $1 trillion. I'm trying to remember if they were $1 trillion or if they were like $500 billion. But anyways, they were larger than Microsoft. They were larger than anybody else at the time. Obviously, the numbers have grown. NVIDIA got up to, I think, almost 3 trillion. But again, it's all relative, right? The size of the internet back then was much different than the size of the internet now. And then hence, obviously, the opportunity around AI to reshape that is different. But you had the largest kind of market cap company in the world. Hence, they had, what felt like unlimited funding, unlimited sort of resources to go and invest in things or acquire things to, kind of solidify their place. The third piece of it was everything that Cisco built was built by Cisco, or at least the vast majority of what they did. So all of their software was proprietary. This was back before the boom of open source software. But they had very much a lock-in of the at the time was called iOS, Internet Operating System, obviously since Apple has come out with their own version of iOS. But they had, deep ties into how anybody was doing networking, how people built their operations center, the tooling they built around it was very much around this software layer. And they were also, everything they built from a hardware perspective, because they were building, routers and switches and firewalls and everything, the vast majority of that was built in their own silicon, right? They built their own ASICs, they built their own chipsets and so forth. It allowed them to optimize things, especially in their biggest platforms, right? In some of the smaller platforms, they didn't necessarily do that. And so there's a lot of parallels that you can draw. John Chambers was talking about how the internet was going to change the way we work, play, live, and learn. And obviously, Jensen talks about AI, changing everything about every application. We're talking about robotics, we're talking about automation, we're talking about all kinds of things. So lots of parallels there. Again, you can decide where there aren't parallels, but lots of high-level sort of parallels in the moment that was the internet and now the moment that is AI. So what I got to thinking about, though, as I was talking to Brandon and them, because we were talking a little bit about like, well, what everybody kind of wants to know, like, what's going to happen next with NVIDIA? Because right now, as NVIDIA goes, to a certain extent, the AI industry goes, right? They are right now the ones making the most money. They are selling the picks and shovels of this AI gold rush. And so very much everybody's trying to figure out, while they're trying to figure out, what's going to happen in the model market and our models, is there any differentiation in models and what's going to be the next great applications built on top of models and so forth. There is very much a, perspective that NVIDIA has a dominance, albeit I don't know if you'd call it a monopoly, but a huge dominance in the AI space, especially around their chipset and to a certain extent, the software that's around that. So nobody really disputes any of that. So, but what I got to thinking about is we had very similar thoughts at Cisco. People were like, hey, when will things ever change for them? They have enough money to buy markets, buy competitors, buy technology. It didn't really feel like there was a way to disrupt what they were doing. And then part of what disrupted them was something that was outside of their control, which was the internet boom had an internet bust. And so you had a lot of companies who had made huge investments, of which part of that was Cisco equipment. Couldn't figure out how to monetize the early internet, right? So, you have your stories of pets.com and van.com and all these sort of things. And, so sort of the first wave of internet, the first moment of internet kind of failed to a certain extent, right? It was, in the bigger picture of things, it was a moment to figure out, what's possible when the world is connected, what's possible when our applications are connected, all the data is available, all those sort of things. But the first approach of doing it from an economic perspective didn't necessarily pan out. And I think to a certain extent, we're seeing some of those parallels, right? Like I'm not trying to be a, gloom and doom about this, but we are seeing, people like Alibaba and Microsoft and others start to say, well, maybe we don't need as much AI data center as we thought we did, which sort of, is a way of forecasting, hey, maybe demand isn't as much, right? We are seeing some pockets of companies making money on, or earning revenue on their AI. So we've seen obviously OpenAI is claiming to be in the billions of dollars around things like ChatGPT. We see companies like Cursor, who's doing AI assistance for developers. Talking about doing a couple of $100 million in ARR, but we haven't really seen anybody talk about the profitability of those dollars, and that's fine. That's a normal type of thing that we hear about in the tech industry all the time. Is that in order to grow these markets, because winner take all, first mover has such a massive advantage. The profitability of those revenues isn't always the first thing. It's we can turn on profitability at some point, but we haven't yet seen those companies that are building these things be necessarily profitable. We're seeing them drive revenue, but the revenues are short of the investments they've made, and that's fine. Right? We've seen that throughout. And that was sort of the first challenge, the first bump that Cisco had in their moment. Right, was their customers weren't making money in their businesses, and hence at some point they stopped buying as much technology from Cisco at the time. In fact, the entire market stopped doing that. Right, and we saw the internet bubble crash. And one of the first things that I remember happening after that, once we all kind of got over the shock of kind of Internet 1.0 kind of crashing, was we started getting phone calls. I was working in some of the groups, and we started getting phone calls from these organizations who came along and they said, hey, would you be interested in similar technology that you have, except with far cheaper price points? So in essence, what this was early days of what we now call merchant silicon. So essentially third parties building kind of, I don't want to call them prototypes, but basically, in the case of Cisco with routers, basically building a router that cost, from a parts perspective, like 1/10, maybe 1/20th the cost of their internal custom ASICs. And it kind of inherently had built into that hardware with some, base operating system things that they include in the platform, about 80%-ish of the functionality and roughly 100% of the performance. And so it was kind of an eye-opening thing, because I think we had a perspective that like we were the only ones who could make this stuff. And maybe the NVIDIA situation is a little bit different because people are, doing amazing jobs of sort of tracking, people like TSMC and where all these things are made. But it was a kind of a wake-up moment that there was a third-party alternative that didn't necessarily look like a Cisco competitor. It wasn't Juniper or 3Com or Cabletron or, any of the others that were sort of, true vendor competitors. This was essentially a third-party market that had said, we want to sort of white box stuff, and then you can then go and customize things on top of it, right? So not only were they kind of breaking the hardware model, but they were breaking a piece of the software model, right? So this was kind of even pre-software-defined networks and software-defined storage. It was sort of, the ability to bring features on top of what was sort of an open operating system, right? It was a variant of Linux at the time. And that was sort of an eye-opening moment, because essentially that was the moment that we knew that the incumbent, Cisco, would still continue to build the top end of products, but we literally had the middle range of the product set and a whole bunch of the business units, like literally calling other business units going, don't do this. Don't go down this path. Don't create this situation. This is, we don't want to sort of lessen what we do. And you had a number of folks that were sort of, groups that were in sort of the bottom and the mid tier of what were networking functionalities or scope or port density or performance that were kind of going, I have huge revenue numbers to make. And if I could, do that in a much more profitable way, i.e. my cost of goods were far less, it was very, very appealing. And it was something that for those of us inside of it said, well, if we don't take advantage of this, other people that want to be in the networking industry are going to take advantage of this, right? And so, that was to me sort of one of the very first things that jumped out as like, oh, the monopoly, the moat has kind of broken, if you will, right? That was the first thing that happened. And so that went on for a couple of years, but the market kind of had to, go through a few years of churn of like, okay, we're not really sure, how to get back to that first initial hype, and we're not really sure how to make money. Obviously, things have changed. The internet figured out how to monetize itself, all that kind of stuff. Then the second thing happened a couple of years later, probably 2 years later, 2004, 2005. And this is when we were beginning to see some companies begin to do stuff like SaaS. And the cloud providers hadn't really taken off, but maybe it was starting to get into like 2006. And I remember somebody coming up to me and saying, hey, what would happen? Because for the most part, Cisco and every vendor at the time sold independently to every single customer they had, big customers, small customers, or whatever. And they kind of controlled all the pricing power because they knew, what pricing looked like, but they didn't, like every customer didn't necessarily know what other customers were paying, right? It was very kind of an opaque market. And I remember somebody coming up to me, this was kind of product strategy, corporate strategy people, and they said, hey, what do you think would happen if this sort of cloud thing, this thing with like SaaS and some other stuff that's starting to happen, again, really in the early days, what happens if we only have like 10 customers as opposed to 10,000 customers? Like, what do you think happens to our world? And we sat down and we thought about it for a long time, and we sort of said, well, to a certain extent, from a technology perspective, they're going to push us very, very hard in new ways that we've never had to, because they're going to build these multi-tenant environments and these highly scalable environments. And, we're beginning to understand what the scale of the internet looked like. But at the same time, we said, that's going to put the ability to have control over pricing in the hands of a very small number of people. And it kind of diminishes or destroys the vendor's ability to have control over pricing, right? You went from thousands of customers kind of disintermediated from knowing what each other were doing to a very small number of them, of which you're probably going to start seeing people move between jobs between those companies, and you really only had a few of them. And the volumes that they were buying at were going to dictate schedules and pricing much more than they do today, where things were spread out over 4 years and 5 years and depreciation cycles and all that kind of stuff. And so, at the time, it was one of those like, well, I kind of hope that doesn't happen too much. The cloud providers hadn't yet taken off, and SaaS hadn't yet become a widely accepted type of thing, Salesforces and so on and so forth of the world. But those two events, the ability to disrupt the hardware software piece with silicon, merchant silicon, and then the ability to sort of disrupt the business model that had built them to where they were in terms of, who your buyers were, the volume of your buyers, and so forth. And you start to think about, could those types of things impact NVIDIA? Could the same sort of history play itself out again? And to a certain extent, you might say, well, they have so much money and they're paying attention to this so much, there's no way that could happen. And we would have thought the same thing with Cisco. But it does make you wonder, because it's very, very difficult for businesses to fundamentally change their business model, right? It's fundamentally more difficult when Wall Street has very, very high expectations, and so much of your identity, the way that you compensate people, the way that you keep loyalty of people to your company, the way that you're able to then fund future innovation is all tied to a certain type of business model, a certain type of reaching customers, all that sort of stuff. It makes you wonder if, the opposite were to happen with NVIDIA, because they don't necessarily have an enterprise sales force. They don't necessarily sell, their way of reaching the enterprise is through the CoreWeaves of the world, through the 5 or 6, really kind of probably 3 or 4 cloud providers that are out there. Does that change if a, lesser or, they get into a market, like a lesser GPU hardware accelerator type of thing comes along and the enterprise is able to sort of buy that directly themselves, or they want to do stuff on premises, right? The ability to not build the biggest and fastest thing. Can you build anything from the bottom? Because if we think about it, we talked about this on the, Cloud and AI show, the power requirements on a per rack basis for the latest and greatest NVIDIA is kind of becoming untenable. And I know there's people who are saying, well, if certain regulations take place and we unlock certain things around the power grid and other stuff. But I mean, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of megawatts of net new power, the location for finding it, the ability to transport that, the ability to do power and cooling and all the other stuff. Like, those are not small feats to necessarily take on, right? So, this is not intended to be a doomerism type of show about what's going on with NVIDIA, but it did get me thinking a lot about, what the next few years, if we don't immediately in this AI moment, find a huge profitable, right? Because remember, Google was profitable early. Facebook was profitable early. A lot of these companies in sort of the second wave of the internet figured out profitability very quickly, through things like advertising and other stuff. OpenAI has not yet figured that out. Maybe they will. Maybe they will become an advertising company. Maybe they will figure out how to charge you $200,000 a year for a PhD level person. Maybe they will figure out how to build a reasoning model that, entices people to spend $200 a month on a consumer base, whatever that might be. Maybe that'll happen. But we haven't yet. We haven't found a profitable AI company, at least wildly profitable, the same way that we did with internet sort of 1.5 and 2.0 and all those sort of things. So it did get me thinking about, if that doesn't necessarily happen right away, if we go through sort of a AI bust, on the consumer side of things, because so much money has been pumped into this and maybe it hasn't yet figured out a way to drive profitability, forget about technical advances and all that stuff. What might happen, right? What other things that are DeepSeek-like in terms of people that don't have nearly the same resources, but have a fierce desire to figure out innovation, to figure out a way to build a profitable business? What changes will happen, right? And again, I draw back to sometimes the history that we've seen in technology is that people oftentimes figure out a way to build cheaper, capable enough capabilities, right? This is, we've seen this over and over and over again. And so I'm very curious, not in finding flaws in NVIDIA, but in seeing what the industry will do as they look at that 900-pound gorilla, but they also realize that many of the things that they're talking about right now don't seem like they're economically viable, or power and cooling viable, or capacity viable, or, prone from any sort of government intervention, regulation, tariff, ban that could be pending over the next couple of years, right? We're not necessarily in a place where those discussions are out of the ordinary. So anyways, I don't really have any answers for it. I do have some historical context, and it did get me thinking a little bit about, how quickly will things like that, which have typically come in our industry and in every trend that we've seen, when will maybe we start to see some of those things? Will it be in the next year? Will it be 2 or 3 years from now? Will it be 5 years from now? But I kind of have a feeling those types of history repeating themselves, history rhyming with something in the past, kind of feel like they're right around the corner because of the sort of intersection we have right now of 900-pound gorilla technology expectations and promises, but economic kind of disconnect from some of those things. So anyways, hope everybody's doing well. Fun sometimes to sort of dive back into the history machine, see if it'll help us have any prognostication about the future. Hopefully this wasn't boring for you. If you're like, I didn't even know what Cisco was, man, I haven't been around that long. I had a chance to speak with some college students last night. They probably would have no idea what we're talking about because most of them were not born when the internet bubble burst the first time. Kind of explained that concept to them, and they kind of looked at me blank faced and we're like, hey, let's move on to something more modern. Anyways, so hope everybody's doing well. Hope your April's going well. Hopefully the pollen's not killing you. I know it's killing me, but it'll be gone soon. Anyways, thanks for listening. Thanks for giving us the feedback. We've getting a bunch of nice feedback from people. Lots of fun shows lined up for the next few months. And with that, we'll wrap it up. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.